Chapter 3. The Tree That Moved. The terrible wind died down almost as suddenly as it had started, and for half an hour or so the common was quite quiet and hushed, and the roar and rumble of the traffic on the roads could be heard quite clearly. The trees stood still as statues, and every creature, small and large, let out a sigh of relief, and began to get its breath back. Even the youngest Wombles, who were fast asleep, stirred and muttered and turned over, for the noise of the wind had been heard deep down in the burrow, and for a week doors had banged and the electric lights had swung backwards and forwards, making leaping shadows on the walls. Of all the Wombles, he was the tidiest, and it irritated him to see his precious workshop piled high with all the things which had been collected from the common. There just hadn't been time to get everything sorted out, and for the last 2 nights he had been dreaming about being overtaken by an avalanche of hats and scarves, papers and boxes, bus tickets and milk cartons. Even the smallest Wombles had been made to help with the cleaning and sorting out. Although they did their best, they weren't properly trained, and they would get underneath Tobermory's paws. "Worst wind I remember," said Tobermory, rubbing his eyes. His fur felt sticky with tiredness. "Ho hum," said Great Uncle Bulgaria, whose memory went further back than his friend's, and who could recall the great storm, which had blown down dozens of trees. "Well, time you went to bed." "What about you?" said Tobermory, putting his paw over his mouth to hide a yawn. "You don't need much sleep when you get to my age," said Great Uncle Bulgaria. "Besides, well, never mind, off you go, old friend, and no more nightmares." Great Uncle Bulgaria drew his tartan shawl more closely around his shoulders and put his paws up on the footstool and blinked at the electric fire. He didn't like sudden silences. A stillness in the air was all right on a lovely summer's evening or a spring night, but in November it didn't feel right, and Great Uncle Bulgaria could sense his fur prickling, which was always a sign of something being not as it should be. "Ha ho hum," muttered Great Uncle Bulgaria as he got up very slowly and felt for his stick, and then shuffled quietly out of his warm room and down the passages, where the only sound was the gentle breathing of the sleeping Wombles and the ticking of the clocks in the workshop. The lights were turned down low, and the old Womble's shadow was pale grey as it now kept up with him, then leapt ahead, then fell behind as he passed each small beacon of light. In spite of his age, Great Uncle Bulgaria moved so softly that he almost surprised the Womble who was on duty at the main doorway. Luckily for the night watch Womble, Great Uncle Bulgaria just happened to drop his stick. "What, who, which, what?" said the Womble, leaping to his paws. "It's me," said Great Uncle Bulgaria, shuffling round the corner and peering through his spectacles. "Who's that?" "Tomsk," said the Womble. He was twice the size of Great Uncle Bulgaria. Indeed, he was the largest Womble on the common. He was also the bravest and the most daring, for he would climb the highest tree or dive to the bottom of the Queen's Mere, and he had once chased after an Alsatian dog. Fortunately, he had not caught it, for he would not have had the least idea what to have done with it. For the truth of the matter was Tomsk had no common sense at all. He had nearly driven Tobermory mad on the one occasion when he had been sent to help in the workshop, for he had put everything away in the wrong place. He was not much good at tidying up either, for he ambled about in his slow, deliberate way, completely forgetting to keep clear of dogs and human beings. So now he was working as a night watch Womble, where even he could hardly make any mistakes. But it was rather a lonely job, so he was quite glad to have someone to talk to, even if that someone was Great Uncle Bulgaria, who could be very fierce. "Asleep?" growled Uncle Bulgaria, prodding Tomsk with his stick. "Yes," said Tomsk, hanging his head and twisting one paw around another. "A Womble can never, under any circumstances, tell a lie." "You should be ashamed of yourself," said Great Uncle Bulgaria. "Womble safety depends on you." "Well, don't do it again, and open up." "Now?" said Tomsk. "Open up now? It's the middle of the night." "I know it's the middle of the night," said Great Uncle Bulgaria. "Go on, go on." Tomsk shook his head and slid back the bolts very slowly, and then opened the door a few inches. "More than that," said Great Uncle Bulgaria. "I want to go out." "Now?" said Tomsk. At which Great Uncle Bulgaria blew out his cheeks and hooked the door open with his stick and shuffled out into the cold, still air. He was glad of his shawl as he made his way through the bushes and out into the dark night. He saw the white and black face of a badger watching him from the shadows and muttered, "Evening." The badger, which, like the Wombles, had been disturbed by the sudden silence, grunted deep in its throat and ambled back into the darkness. A couple of rats squeaked, and for a second their eyes shone in the starlight, and then they too were gone. Great Uncle Bulgaria looked up at the sky and saw that the stars were vanishing one by one as the clouds came rolling in from the west. He sniffed the air, turning his head from side to side, and again his fur prickled, for he could smell rain coming. Not just a shower, or even a good soaking, but a real downpour. There were thousands of gallons of water up in that clouding sky, and Great Uncle Bulgaria didn't care for the smell of it at all. "Anything the matter?" whispered Tomsk, looming up behind him. "It's going to rain," said Great Uncle Bulgaria, and pattered back towards the burrow, leaving Tomsk more puzzled than ever. As always, Great Uncle Bulgaria was perfectly correct. The rain started with a soft sighing sound at 10 minutes past 2. As the night wore on, the rain grew heavier and heavier, and when the first Wombles stirred just before dawn, it was coming down in steady, driving sheets, which were so thick you could hardly see through them. "It's raining," announced Tomsk to Bungo, as he came bouncing jauntily down the passage. "How can you tell?" said Bungo cheekily. "Because I've seen it," said Tomsk, "and it was wet." "Oh, you are clever," said Bungo, very rudely indeed, and went to get his basket from the workshop. Tobermory issued him with a pair of gumboots, an oilskin, and a Sylvester hat as well. "I don't mind a drop of rain," said Bungo. "This isn't a drop, it's a flood," said Tobermory. "Don't argue." He had slept quite well, but he still wasn't in the best of tempers. Bungo made a face to himself and put on his rain clothes and went clumping off to the main door. He thought it was all a lot of fuss about nothing, until he got outside. And then he blinked and choked because it was exactly like stepping into a waterfall. The rain plopped onto his hat and ran down the brim and fell onto his collar and slid down his coat and pattered onto his boots. It turned the grass into mud under his paws, and it turned all the bits of paper into a horrid pulpy mess as he tried to pick them up. But the rain did much more than that, for it loosened the earth around the roots of the trees and gently but firmly swept it away in little rivers of mud. And the mud ran down the banks, and the little rivers grew larger, and they bit deeper and deeper into the ground until they made narrow valleys, and everything got swept along before them. Sticks and stones and old leaves and bits of rubbish, they went tumbling downwards, leaving behind them uncovered roots which had nothing on which to take a grip. and at the same time the water in Queensmere began to rise. Little by little, and inch by inch, it rose, until it lapped over onto the paths and met and mingled with the muddy streams coming down their sides. "It's raining," announced Bungo, when he finally straggled back to the burrow. "Told you so," said Tomsk. "You do look wet." "I am wet," said Bungo, taking off his rain-clothes and shaking himself violently. "Give us a pull with these boots." Tomsk took a good grip on them and pulled. Because he was so strong, the boots came off at once, and Tomsk went staggering backwards and sat down with a thump, which made his teeth rattle. "Thanks," said Bungo, and went off whistling, without even bothering to find out if Tomsk was hurt. Like a great many other Wombles, Bungo didn't bother much about Tomsk, so Tomsk just sat still for a moment, feeling rather sad for some reason. And it was while he was sitting that he noticed that a few leaves and bits of stick by the doorway were moving. "That's funny," said Tomsk, sitting on the ground with the boots in his lap. "That's very funny." "What is?" asked Orinoco, coming in and stepping over Tomsk and shaking himself just as Bungo had done. "The ground's moving," said Tomsk. "It's wobbling like a jelly." "Jelly?" said Orinoco, brightening up. "Jelly, did you say? I hope it's blackberry jelly, because that's one of my favourites. Hang up for my coat for me, will you? I've had a very hard morning." And off went Orinoco, with 6 wet bus tickets in the bottom of his tidy bag, and the firm belief in his head that he had been working every minute of the last 3 hours, instead of trying to find somewhere to shelter and to have a nice 40 winks. "It is moving," said Tomsk, who once he had got hold of an idea, stuck to it very firmly. But all the other Wombles were too busy about their own affairs to take any notice of him. So Tomsk put the boots in a nice neat line and hung up the raincoats and hats, and then went back to watch the leaves and twigs creeping down the track towards the main door. It was really quite a frightening thing to see, but Tomsk was not a nervous Womble, so his fur didn't prickle as great Uncle Bulgaria's would have done if he had been there. The small tide of mud lapped over the doorstep, and when Tomsk put his paw there, the mud just went around the sides of it. Tomsk didn't care for the feeling very much, and after thinking about it, he decided to go and get a broom from the workshop. "What do you want?" growled Tobermory, whose fur was now covered with so many mushy pieces of white paper that he looked as if he had been making pastry. "A broom," said Tomsk. "You don't need a broom," said Tobermory. "There now, you've made me lose count of these dratted baskets, and you've left dirty paw marks right across my floor." "It's only one paw that's dirty," said Tomsk, holding it up to show Tobermory, "and I want a broom to stop the ground moving." "Don't come here with your nonsense," said Tobermory, seizing Tomsk by the shoulders and pushing him towards the door. "The ground doesn't move unless it's an earthquake, you silly great gormless Womble." "But," said Tomsk. However, the door had been firmly shut in his face, so Tomsk gave an enormous sigh and went back to his post, only to discover that his neat row of boots had all been pushed out of line by the moving mud, and, what was more, the hooks on which he had hung the dripping raincoats were all bulging out from the wall. Tomsk put one of his large paws against the wall, and a crack appeared, and ran right from the ceiling to the floor. It was really quite a frightening thing to see, but Tomsk was not a nervous Womble, so his fur didn't prickle as Great Uncle Bulgaria's would have done if he had been there. The small tide of mud lapped over the doorstep, and when Tomsk put his paw there, the mud just went around the sides of it. It was such a nasty feeling that Tomsk decided there and then that he had better do something about it. If he couldn't get hold of a broom, then a piece of brushwood could be the next best thing. He knew he wasn't supposed to desert his post until it was mealtime, but the mud sliding down the passage was more important than anything else. Tomsk put on the nearest hat and edged round the door and out into the driving rain. He nearly had to close his eyes to see properly, and each time he touched a branch or a bush he got another shower bath. But he only shook himself and went on searching for a nice large piece of brushwood. His paws had just closed on a sturdy branch when, as well as the steady roar of the rain, Tomsk heard something else. It was a sound that he had never heard before, even on this day of surprises, and although he was so wet, it made his fur stand up in little prickly bunches. It was a deep and terrible sigh. Tomsk put back his head and looked up, and there above him was a tall, thin tree, which was moving too. Not one breath of wind was there, and yet, although he had to keep blinking to keep the rain out of his eyes, Tomsk could see that the tree was slowly, but deliberately, bending over. "Stop! Don't do that!" shouted Tomsk. The tree sighed and shivered and creaked, and 2 squirrels ran along its topmost branches and leapt for the safety of a nearby neighbour. "Don't! Don't! Don't!" implored Tomsk, jumping up and down and banging his paws together. "Ooh!" sighed the tree and leant over even further. Tomsk looked round in a distracted fashion, but there wasn't another Womble in sight. So without stopping to think any more, Tomsk launched himself through the brambles and the bushes and wrapped his strong arms round the trunk of the tree, scrabbling with his back paws to get a firm grip on the muddy ground. "Help!" shouted Tomsk through the roar of the rain. "Help, Wombles, help!" But there was no answer, except from the tree, which sighed yet again, and despite Tomsk's enormous efforts, began to tilt slowly towards the roof of the Womble burrow. Tomsk dug his paws still deeper into the mud, closed his eyes, and hung on with all his strength.